The question whether Harold Godwinson survived his deadly encounter with William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is not one that's often asked. But today we're going to be delving into it because there's a couple of quite old primary sources that do deal with the idea that Harold Godwinson may not have died at the Battle of Hastings. So let's get into them, shall we? For anyone who doesn't know who Harold Godwinson is, a bit of backstory. So Harold Godwinson was crowned king after Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor had been king for quite a long time, a couple of decades at this point, and he was getting old, so he needed somebody to replace him. The most stable choice was Harold Godwinson, but another man named William the Conqueror argued that he had been promised the throne, so he invaded England. Here we have some images showing William the Conqueror preparing for battle against Harold. He's building lots of ships and he has lots of troops ready to fight. Now this is from something called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is an absolutely amazing piece of art created shortly after the Battle of Hastings and Harold's presumed death. But it wasn't just William who wanted the English throne. There was another man called Harold Hardrada, who was a Viking, king of Norway, who invaded not long before William the Conqueror did. So Harold's army was already quite tired from fighting off the Viking invader. So you can imagine how tired Harold Godwinson's army was after fighting off the Viking invader just a few weeks before he fought William at the Battle of Hastings. So William landed with a superior force, knights, men-at-arms, fully trained soldiers. Harold's army was mostly made up of peasants, loyal Englishmen who would fight for him, but weren't very well equipped. Despite trying his best, Harold unfortunately died, either with an arrow to the eye, or being cut down by knights. Now some historians say that it was perhaps a combination of the two, that he got an arrow to the eye and then was cut down by knights. I have an alternative theory, but we're not going to get into that in this video. In this video we're talking about, did Harold Godwinson survive the Battle of Hastings? The focus of this video will be on three main articles saying that Harold survived the battle. The first one is called the Vita Haroldi, which was written around 1205, so about 150 years after the battle. This is incredibly important because it claims that Harold Godwinson survived the battle. So the Vita Haroldi is written in Latin, and it was written by a monk at Walthorn Abbey, most likely. Now this is very significant because allegedly King Harold is buried there. The Vita Haroldi begins pretty bog-standardly. It talks about Harold Godwinson's father and his exploits. It also mentions the substantial fact that Harold Godwinson himself was half Viking, his mother being the daughter of a previous Viking king. It then talks a little bit about Harold himself. The Vita Haroldi names a man called Sybrecht, who was apparently a servant of Harold, and he uses this man subsequently as a bit of a sort of source of information for what he says next. So we'll skip forward to after the Battle of Hastings. Harold is left for dead by the Normans, but is healed by a Muslim Saracen woman in Winchester, and he stays there healing for 2 years. He then visits Saxony and Denmark, trying to find soldiers to invade England, but he finds no help for his cause. Now I find this a bit weird, because if Harold Godwinson was allegedly going round Denmark in 1068 trying to find soldiers, would it not have made sense for him to join up with his son's armies, who actually did try to re-invade England after their father was killed? Very weird, very suspicious. Anyway, so Harold finds that God has turned against him and obviously doesn't want him to be king. And then King Harold Godwinson travels to Rome, which is bizarre because the Roman papacy actually endorsed William to invade England. But we're moving past that. He goes to Rome for some reason. Whatever. The writer of the Vita Haroldi then praises Harold's piety, which is very nice of him. So Harold returns to England after many years of travelling and calls himself Christian. And he becomes a hermit in a cave near Dover and lives there for a decade. Then he journeys to Wales and lives a quite low-profile life. The Vita Haroldi bizarrely mentions that he was attacked by the brutal natives of Wales, but he showed them the true religion and returned them to good. So there we go. When he got a bit older, he moved to St John's Church in Chester, while still pretending to be the man called Christian. Now it's almost like a sort of Jesus-esque identity, which I think is what the writer was going for. Now the author at this point goes off on a bit of a tangent to consider other accounts of Harold's end. He mentions William of Malmesbury's account, which wrote that Harold Godwinson did indeed die at the Battle of Hastings. But he commends Alfred of Riverlax for allowing the possibility that he survived it. The writer of the Vita Haroldi then says that Waltham Abbey's claim that Harold was buried there is a mistake, and another body on the battlefield must have been mistaken for Harold's and buried there instead. And he backs this up by a claim that Harold's brother, Garth, when he went to the Abbey of Waltham during the reign of Henry II, said that, "Hey, this isn't my brother's body." Then the Vita Haroldi finishes with the account of King Harold's last days, where he reveals his identity and dies. There's one copy surviving of the Vita Haroldi, and you can find it in the British Library. It's a copy made about 150 years after. The next source I use is the Jatvardar Saga, which is an Icelandic saga written in the 1300s. The Jatvarar Saga is really interesting because I've actually written extensively about it before. It notes how after the Norman invasion, lots of Saxon elites emigrated outside of the country, escaped almost from the oppressive Norman reign that was to be followed. And they set up a colony called New England in the Black Sea after visiting the Holy Roman Emperor. But that's a story for another time. The Jatvarar Saga talks about Harold being knocked out in the battle and his friends finding him alive afterwards and nursing him back to health. It wasn't a Muslim Norman this time, it was his friends who found him. The Jatvarar Saga differs somewhat from the Vita Haroldi because in this version his friends immediately offer him the chance to win back his throne instead of Harold travelling the world trying to recruit troops, and he says, "No, I've had enough of fighting and I'm going to settle down, whatever, and become a hermit." The next source is by far the most mainstream, and it's a BBC article 11 years ago written by a historian called Peter Burke, and he had a theory that the king recovered and lived for 40 years after the battle in 1066. So this historian Peter Burke is so confident of this, he actually sponsored a search for the remains of King Harold in Waltham Abbey, and Burke's claims are quite similar to the Vita Haroldi, which is what he uses as a source, but instead of saying that the king travelled to Denmark, he mentions Germany, and he says that the monk who discovered the king's secret is actually the one who wrote the Vita Haroldi. There's a follow-up article a year later, and it's a bit bizarre because they've done this scan of the abbey and they actually found remains. And so this historian Burke says, "Aha! These must be the remains of King Harold." And this is the weird thing, because even if they are, it doesn't prove that Harold survived, because the story was that he was always buried there. And then Mr. Burke, the historian, goes on to say that the symbols on the walls above the unmarked grave and the time period it appears to be from are all exactly as I said, which is apparently proof that Harold survived, even though it's not. But anyway, so he wanted to dig him up and test the bones to be Harold, and the abbey said, "We're not going to let you do that." So that's the end of that story there. Despite these theories, there is an absolutely overwhelming amount of evidence that Harold did die at the Battle of Hastings. Firstly, William the Conqueror, Harold's mother, and Harold's widow all examined the body. Secondly, if he had survived, why did he never ever try and see his family again? And thirdly, why did he not join up with the rebellions against William the Conqueror? So whilst these legends are very interesting, I think we can condemn them to the mythical category. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope I can do some more on cryptozoology soon, because that would be really exciting. So please like and subscribe and leave a comment if you want as well, and goodbye.